I like to think I like to think that I often come to the work that I do with a decolonial lens. And I like to say out loud that the North America is not my center. Europe is not my center. I am still influenced through education in the academy in terms of theoretical frameworks and methodology and how I see the world. So it's an ongoing process, right? I like to say that because it comes out in my language and the tensions exist, right? And I like to see the work that I engage in or the lens that I bring to the work really from an ancestral way of living. And I like to acknowledge that Indigenous ways of living holds equal weight to Western science and that they can both coexist. So before I talk about millet, I want to just briefly just touch on African grains on the African continent, and to state that the African continent has more grains than any other continent. It has its own variety of rice, Oryza glaberrima, right here in the middle, that has roots in Senegal, Lower Casamance. It has its own millet, different varieties of millets, as we'll talk about: barley, sorghum, teff, fonio, its own variety of wheat, and dozens of wild grains that are not yet domesticated. African grains have fed people for over thousands of years. If you follow the travel of Oryza glaberrima, and you follow the travel of pearl millet, you will realize that African foods have contributed greatly to the world's food systems. And I think this recognition is always important, and that because of colonialism and capitalism and a broken food system that focuses on exploitation and extraction, that very often that narrative is not told. The potential for African grains, such as millet, as this group has been learning, has been overlooked, right? But a lot of communities already know what this potential is. And I know that there is an opportunity to improve nutrition around the globe with millet. But I also want to recognize, as I go into millet, the role that peasant farmers and rural farmers and small-scale farmers and women farmers have played in preserving sustainable practices around grains. I think it's important, and the role that they have played in conserving and protecting the environment. I know that you've had 2 sessions on millet, so this will be very quick, and then I'll get into it. So as you already know in this group, that millet generally represents a diverse group of cereals, crops that typically produce small seeds, and that generally within the category of millets, as you probably covered, on the African continent though, we have fonio, sorghum, finger millet, Guinea millet, pearl, teff. All these are often under the categories of millet. And then very specifically, I guess in terms of usage or language, then we have the pearl millet here, which is more indigenous, I would say, or used in West Africa. And then we have the finger millet, which is used in East Africa. So the finger millet, just to quickly kind of go through the millet, originated in the highlands of Uganda and Ethiopia. Finger millet is grown throughout southern and eastern Africa. It's consumed in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe. And it has now declined in the consumption because of the influx of corn and the influx of foreign foods. But finger millet was traditionally used to hold celebrations for new harvest. It's used to make bread. It was used to serve food to neighbors and visitors. It's also used to make porridge. So in my home, in the Upper East region of Ghana, where I was born, when someone comes in as a visitor, if you walk in and as a stranger or whatever, if you're visiting someone, the first thing they give you is a meal called zom. So zom is made from ground millet. So they ground the millet, and then they add a little bit of shea butter and water, tamarind and spices, and then they mix it together and they give it to you to drink. It's the first thing you give when a visitor comes. And in that, you're being welcomed. We're saying that you're welcome. You can rest here. You know, eat this food, rest from your journey. My mother often tells me that my grandfather, her father, every morning would eat zome, right? If a farmer ate zome, that's what it's called, the millet and the shea butter and the water, you wouldn't have to eat until dinner time, right? The zome could really carry you. And what happened is when corn started coming in and people have corn porridge, that couldn't really hold them, right? They'll drink the corn porridge in the morning and they'll be hungry in the afternoon. So when you go in, and because the zome had the millet, it had the shea butter, it had all the other spices that went with it, it had the tamarind. So it was nutrient dense, right? Foods that you were consuming. And it was made from pearl millet, right? And pearl millet was domesticated in West Africa about 4,000 years ago. It's popular and is the world's maybe 5th or 6th largest cereal crop. And then we have Guinea millet as well. It's more known around the remote areas or remote regions of Guinea. And I think as previously mentioned, we have fonio, which is more popular or sort of the roots in Senegal, but in the northern part of Ghana, in Tamale area, we grow fonio. So why millet? And I know you've gone through this, and I always like to say, millet is the superhero. Not all heroes wear cape, and I think that's what millet is. So 2 years ago, I visited a farmer in northern part of Ghana that we work with on the seed project. I went to visit him, and he gave me a pumpkin that's indigenous to the northern part of Ghana. When he gave me I had never seen a pumpkin. I had no idea that we had our own pumpkin. Constantly learning and uncovering things. So when he gave me the pumpkin, he was telling me that the pumpkin is usually grown with millet and sorghum, as well as bambara beans and groundnuts. And that reminded me of the North American three sisters, right? You have the bean, the corn, and the pumpkin. And I was like, oh, like the connection. I was like, oh my God, that is so true. Like the grains is the millet and the sorghum. We have our pumpkin, and the legume, it's either the groundnut or the bambara beans, right? And for me, it was really looking at the wisdom of the three sister system, right? What is that telling us about biodiversity? What is that telling us about conservation? What is that telling us about indigenous food systems? The power of millet is that it's able to grow on marginal lands, right? It's known as climate resilient foods, and I'll get into that. I'm always like, these foods existed before a climate crisis. They are beyond being called climate resilient foods. But millet has a long shelf storage. It can be stored for years. Pearl millet is most tolerant of heat and drought. Whether it's heavy rains or light rains, millet will grow. It has the power to yield reliably in different regions as well, whether it's too hot, whether it's too rainy. And as we're in a world where we're constantly talking about the shortage of resources, in particular water, we can see that a crop such as millet, right, is useful within the context of a space where water is becoming a limited resource. Whereas in agriculture, one of agricultural's biggest use is water. So millet can depend on rainfall, and it doesn't really need a lot of water to grow. So in the northern part of Ghana, we have the early millet and we have the late millet. So the early millet, they all planted around the same time. It's planted late May, early June, and it's harvested, 3 months is harvested in September. And then the late millet goes up to 6 months. So that's when the Hamatan season comes in. That's when the dry season comes in. So the early millet is harvested, and then it's consumed from like October, November, December, etc. And then late November, when the late millet is harvested, then that's consumed in the dry season, January, February, March. What's currently happening, because of the impact of climate change and rainfall patterns, even though millet can still grow, it's becoming more challenging for a lot of farmers, because as the rainy season is still getting shorter and shorter with less rains, it's becoming difficult for a lot of farmers to be able to grow a lot of the late millet, right? These are things that we're learning through the BILA seed program. Oops. Another key piece of millet is also that, so going back to Taste of Volga, I do this program called Taste of Volga. So just to give a bit of background. I was involved in a lot of food movements in Toronto, and then I became really interested around what was happening around ancestral foods in Ghana. So we went to the northern part of Ghana, where I'm already from, already have relationships I've been visiting, and realized that a lot of our indigenous foods were missing, like millet was being replaced by corn, soybean, shade trees, baobab trees were being cut down, being built by mango trees and other fruit trees. And these are indigenous trees that no one planted. They've been there for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. And it's like, why are we cutting down ancestral trees to grow fruit? Anyways, different conversation, because I can get worked up on that. But one of the things that I realized was also missing was not just indigenous foods, but the knowledges and the practices that come with being able to grow a lot of indigenous and ancestral foods. So millet, for instance, one, there are a lot of war stories, right? And a lot of practices that come with not just growing millet, but also harvesting and cooking millet. So one of the things that we do in terms of Taste of Bolga is that I wanted to be able to bring folks to reconnect back to ancestral ways of living, not just it being like this romantic idea of let's go back to the land, but really coming and seeing what it took, right? In terms of the communal aspect, the knowledge, the practice, the relationships that are built in ancestral ways of living. One of the things that I quickly realized when I was doing the Taste of Bolga was how important millet was, right? So the breakfast we have in the morning, cocoa, it's made from fermented, it's made from millet. The masa that we would have was made from millet. The dinner that we would have was made from millet. So the foods were either made from millet or sorghum, right? In so many different ways. And I grew up eating this way in Toronto. These are my mom's food. She eats this way. But I didn't make the connection until I was there, when I became very attentive. And I was like, oh my God, millet is a core part of what we're eating and how we eat. So what happens? And a lot of these foods are also fermented. So what I realized through that process was that millet connects us to our heritage. It's our lineage, right? If my mother told me stories about her father who would have Zoom in the morning before he went out, right? That's a story of a family. That's a story of heritage and lineage. One of the things that I also quickly realized was that we just don't consume millet, we ferment it. When I started to pay attention, I realized how important fermentation really was to how we utilize grains, right? And fermentation is a process that preserves the nutritional and sensory qualities. It extends the shelf life of the food. It enhances the nutritional intake and the vitamins. It provides a variety of ways to digest grains. So here we have cocoa. Cocoa takes about 2 or 3 days to make, depending on who makes it. So this is the night of one of the events of Taste of Bolga, and we're working with the women to make it. So you soak the millet. The first night you soak it. The second day you throw away the water. Then you soak it again. And then you add, you soak it the second night, you throw away the water again. And then the third day, when you're going to mill it, then you add the ginger and the spices, etc. And then after you've milled it, then this is the process of seeping into it. And then cooking it is a whole different process on its own. And then here is sorghum, a sorghum drink that they make, like a fermented sorghum beer that is called pito as well. And that also takes a perhaps similar process. But one of the things that I realized when it comes to millet here and fermentation is the knowledge of that fermentation process, right? If we don't have these ancestral foods with us, how will we preserve the fermentation knowledge and skills and practices that come with it, right? So once again, when you're doing the pito, they soak the sorghum on the first night. The second night, they throw away the water, and then they spread the sorghum out. So you spread the sorghum out, and then the next day, you sprinkle water on it. And then when it starts to look like it kind of shoots a little bit, I think it sprouts, sorry, the language is sprouts. When it sprouts, that's when you take it and then you mill it and then you separate the water and then you boil it, right? A lot of these knowledges are not just something that you find in a textbook or that you just find in a research paper. And even if you were to find it in a textbook or research paper, you miss the cultural practices that come with preserving this grain is often missing. And then this last piece is called masa. Masa, if you haven't had it, it's delicious and it's crunchy. It's made from millet. It has its own fermentation process as well. So all these three foods have like different ways of being fermented. And what I love about masa is that it's fried in shea butter, right? So millet also, the way millet is cooked is that we use shea butter in the northern part of Ghana is the primary cooking oil. It's healthy, it's high in vitamin E. And not only do we use it for skin, but there's also a particular way in which we use it. But consuming millet also brings with it the kinds of food processes that come with it. So all of these traditional, traditional cooking utensils are used in the process for most of it, in boiling it and frying this. Like oils that are indigenous to the land are what's being used. And also all the different knowledges, right, that come with how these processes are made. Another key piece in terms of preserving indigenous grains, in particular millet, sorghum, the fonio's, Guinea millet, is also the role that women play. My mom was the one who connected me to ancestral food practices. In Toronto, my mom would make dawa dawa. Dawa dawa is this like fermented African locust bean. It has like an umami taste to it. It tastes delicious, but it's very strong in the scent. So my mom would make it in the apartment. And if I wanted to go out, I'd have to put like a towel on me just not to get the scent on me. Or if you're in the hallway and you are coming, and like you're like, this is an African family. This is not a Canadian. But I remember being in middle school, when you're in middle school, and because of the understanding of cultural food, sometimes you're a little bit embarrassed. But getting older, I'm like, yes, this is dawa dawa. These are our foods. So my mom cooked a lot of these foods in Toronto. She cooked millet. She would actually go to the Indian store and get millet. Or if someone traveled to Ghana, and I'm sure other folks know this. And so we don't tell when people are traveling, because if you're traveling and you tell other folks, you know that you be bringing spices and other foods that are hard to get here. And so millet, fermenting it, all these other foods my mom was making. My dad was also a health freak into health and sustainability. So I kind of took both of those processes. But what I want to highlight here is that women play an essential role in the knowledge and the preservation, not just of millet, but also of ancestral foodways. When it comes to harvesting the foods, when it comes to processing the foods, for instance, in the Taste of Bulga event, is the women that are leading this, as you can see in the pictures, right? So when it comes to buying the grains or even taking the grains from what they had in the farming season, going to the mill, so soaking it, washing it, cleaning it, knowing how much water to add, knowing the temperature of the water, taking it to the mill, the community mill, bringing it back, and also cooking it, right? So the communal aspect of food and sharing and the knowledges, doing this Taste of Bulga, everybody has a role, like just how they share and pass. It's like almost like a learning and a knowledge exchange. What's also interesting, what I realized is that when the rains come down in the rainy season, the women will plant the pumpkin, the granules, the bambara beans, and the men will plant the millet and sorghum and corn. It is not that strict, but it's sort of the flow of who plants what. Women are also the ones that are saving a lot of the indigenous seeds, right? So when it comes to seed preservation, household food security, it's a lot of the women that are preserving a lot of these ancestral indigenous foods. So I also thought it was very important to mention that. So what's happening? What's really happening when it comes to our grains and our food systems here? So currently, as many of you may or may not know, we're losing a lot of our indigenous local foods to international seed laws. And we have two key laws. So we have UPOV, is the Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants. It's an intergovernmental organization responsible for implementing plant breeders' rights at the international level. Initially, when UPOV started, UPOFs 1978, 1991, 1994, etc., all these amendments, it was initially supposed to, yes, protect plant breeders' right, but also protect farmers' rights. What has happened is that in the 1991 UPOF, the Union for Protection of New Varieties of Plant, that the breeders' right